When I first heard about NXIVM, or Nexium, it was through a friend who had attended one of their executive success programs. She spoke glowingly about the personal development courses, the community, and how the teachings had changed her life. The promise of self-improvement, leadership skills, and the allure of being part of an elite group of thinkers and doers was intoxicating, really. I was at a point in my life where I felt directionless and eager for something that could provide both purpose and community. I attended my first Nexium seminar out of curiosity and was immediately drawn in by the sophisticated jargon, the sense of exclusivity, and the charismatic leadership of Keith Raniere. The courses were expensive but promised rapid personal growth, which seemed like a fair trade at the time. The workshops were intense, filled with long hours of introspective exercises, group discussions, and what they called ethical training. It all felt like a step towards becoming a better version of myself. Now, over time, I became more deeply involved, moving up through the ranks of their curriculum. I met many intelligent and successful people who seemed genuinely transformed by their experiences. I was part of a community that celebrated personal empowerment and seemed to shun conventional societal norms in favor of a more enlightened approach to life. The jargon, terms like ESP, Executive Success Programs, EM, Ethical Movement, and Vanguard for Raniere himself, gave us a sense of belonging to something special, almost like a secret society. The structure of Nexium was intriguing too. It was hierarchical. The inner circles where you could move up by demonstrating loyalty, financial investment, and adherence to the teachings. There was always another level to achieve, another course to take, another way to strip away your limitations. This constant push for more was disguised as personal growth, but was really a tool for control, something I didn't fully grasp at the time. I recall the first time that I met Keith Raniere, or Vanguard as he was called by his followers. He had this aura of omniscience, like he could see right through you to your core issues. His talks were mesmerizing, filled with philosophical insights and psychological tricks that seemed to elevate your understanding of the world. But looking back, they were also manipulative, designed to make you doubt yourself and rely on his guidance, and my perception only really began to shift when I was invited to join what was described as an even more elite group within Nexium, called DOS. I was told it was a sorority for women committed to deeper levels of personal discipline and empowerment, led by women for women. The secrecy and the promise of an even higher level of personal evolution was intriguing, but the initiation into DOS was unlike anything I had experienced at Nexium before. It was here that the facade began to crumble. I was asked to provide collateral, sensitive personal information or compromising photos as a sign of trust and commitment. This was justified as ensuring my dedication to the group's secrecy and my personal growth. The discomfort was immediate, but I was too deep in the Nexium mindset to see it for what it was at first. The revelation came when I learned about the branding ceremony. Women weren't just committed to a group, they were being branded with a symbol that, unbeknownst to them at the time, was a combination of Keith Raniere's and his partner Allison Mack's initials. The branding was done under the guise of a sisterhood ritual, but the reality was far more sinister. It was a sign of ownership, a mark of slavery. I was horrified. The realization that what I thought was an empowerment group was actually a front for a master-slave dynamic, and it was shattering. Women were expected to follow commands from their masters, which included intimate servitude, extreme dieting, and absolute obedience. The women were not just controlled, they were manipulated into believing that they were in control of their choices while being stripped away of their agency. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Here I was, thinking I was part of a movement towards enlightenment, only to find out that I was on the brink of being drawn into a cult where human rights were being egregiously violated. I felt betrayed, not just by the leaders, but by the system that I had begun to trust so deeply. And what made it even more chilling was the realization that many of the women in DOS were not just victims, but also enforcers of this system. They had been indoctrinated into believing that this was part of a noble cause, and their own status within the hierarchy depended on how well they could control others. This created a cycle of abuse where victims became victimizers, all under the banner of personal growth. And my exit from NXIVM was not easy. The psychological grip was strong, and there was the ever-looming threat of my collateral being exposed. But I managed to leave, thanks in part to supportive friends outside the organization who helped me see the reality of my situation. The aftermath was a period of intense reflection and recovery. I had to rebuild my sense of self, my trust in others, and understand how I had been so thoroughly deceived. This experience left a very profound impact on me. It taught me to be wary of where the path to self-improvement might lead, especially when it demands secrecy, blind loyalty, and the surrender of personal autonomy. It was a harsh lesson in the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of charismatic leadership unchecked by accountability. Looking back, I see how NXIVM used the guise of power to exploit vulnerabilities and manipulate minds, even control lives. The allure of belonging to something greater, the promise of transformation, and the manipulation through psychological techniques were all tools in the hands of those who sought to do one and one thing alone: dominate. My name's Darren. I'm from Cornwall, and I don't know if this counts as a scary story in the traditional sense, but it scared me, so maybe it'll scare you too. So basically, a few years ago, I found out that an old schoolmate of mine had become the youngest ever person in the UK to be convicted of being a terrorist. The police raided his mum and dad's house back in 2019 and nicknamed him after they found instructions on how to make bombs. He went to court over it, but managed to dodge prison time because of how young he was when he downloaded the instructions. The local paper said that he was a neo-Nazi, and I'm not disputing that because apparently the old Bill found all sorts of Hitler stuff when they raided his bedroom. But when I looked into it myself, there was way more to it than that. When I first heard about it, I read every single article about it that I could get my hands on. I used to be dead pally with the guy back in year 7 and year 8 and seemed like an alright kid back then. But then apparently after I moved schools at the start of year 9, he took a drastic turn for the worse. The whole thing hit really close to home, so you can imagine I wanted to know as much about it as I possibly could, mainly because I wanted to know what had gone so wrong in the guy's life that he thought about making bombs. And that's how I discovered, while reading one online article, that my old pal had been visiting the website of a group known as O9A. And the article kind of glossed over any details on the group and stated that they were neo-Nazis and just moved on. But like I said, there was a lot more to it than that. Having read a lot about various UK neo-Nazi groups while researching my old pal's arrest, the name O9A jumped out at me immediately because I've never heard of it before. I'd read all about the National Front, National Action, and the likes of Combat 18, but never anything about a group called O9A. So out of sheer curiosity, I decided to do some research on them to see what my old pal had gotten himself into. Then from the moment I plugged the name into Google, I think my jaw stayed on the floor for the whole time. O9A stands for the Order of the Nine Angles, and that's angles, not angels. And to put it in the simplest terms possible, they're Nazi Satanists. They want to tear down society which they think is controlled by Jews and build a new one based on paganism and a sort of survival of the fittest mentality. One of their big beliefs is human sacrifice, which they think will speed up the downfall of civilization. But they're not all talk when it comes to actually inflicting suffering and things like that, as I found out for myself when I looked them up. In the summer of 1997, 2 Swedish members of the O9A committed the Keelers Park murder, which was where those 2 blokes tried to ritually sacrifice an Algerian man. Then in 2019, an American soldier was found out to be a member of the Order of the Nine Angles and was planning on kidnapping and killing his fellow soldiers in the name of Satan. I know you're probably thinking, okay, I was with you till you tried making out that there's satanic terrorists in the US Army, but please, If you think I'm trying to mess with you, then look it up. The fella's name is Ethan Melzer, and there's a bloody New York Times article about the whole thing. And this is legit, not just some stupid creepypasta. The year after that, another soldier was found to be a member of 09A, only this was a member of a group within the 09A called, and you might want to spell this out instead of saying it so you don't get in trouble, the RAPE Waffen. The group of scumbags hatched the idea of violating white girls and getting them pregnant from it so that more white babies would be born. Like I said, my jaw is resting firmly on the floor by this point as I was reading stuff like that, and because it legitimately sounds like badly written blue hair fan fiction, I had to stop and look all this up as I was reading it, only to find out that, yeah, it was all true. Another one that sounded too insane to be true was the story about another member of the Order of Nine Angles, whose name I've got handy, but I don't know that you want to edit it out, but he's named Luke Austin Lane. He and his two mates were caught planning the murder of some Antifa couple. And yeah, I'm no fan of Antifa, but this bloke was actually planning on killing this couple's kids in front of them before finishing them off in turn. They're kids, man. What kind of scumbag deliberately executes innocent kids like that? And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, but it kept going. To prepare for the murders, Luke Lane and his mates killed a sheep, drank its blood, and then took a lot of LSD or mushrooms or something to go on a sort of spiritual journey. I read another thing about a bloke in Canada who killed a Muslim guy, and then I think he stabbed some Sikh fella, and then when he was caught, boom, police found out that he was a member of 09A. And there are loads more satanic murders like that, mainly in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, and they're all connected to what is literally a satanic terrorist group. But to be honest, that's not even the half of it. Because if you look up all the stuff that the Order's members are involved in, you start seeing this same sick pattern playing out over and over again. Excluding 2018, every single year for the past 7 years, a member of the Order of the Nine Angles had been arrested and convicted of being a child abuser, be that through having material on their hard drives or actually doing disgusting things themselves. Most of these incidents have been in the UK, but as of 2021, they've spread to America and Sweden too. But then, as much as you might think that these dudes are just straight-up creeps, and hear me out about this one, I don't think that's necessarily the case. The Order of the Nine Angles has these 2 documents about human sacrifices. One's called A Gift for the Prince, and the other is called Calling, A Guide to Sacrifice. Most of their literature is absolute garbage. Like, it's legitimately difficult because of how much jargon and inside language they use, but there's one bit that really stood out to me. Something that makes me think that all the CSEM stuff is basically part of their ethos. The Order says that human sacrifice isn't just confined to killing people. If they were burning and decapitating people every week, they'd all be caught in no time, right? Well, to continually propagate human suffering without overly alerting the authorities, the Order distributes CSEM as a way of sort of feeding evil, if that makes sense. It sounded wild to me at first, too. I can promise you, but the more I read and the more I thought about it, the more it all started to make this sort of horrible kind of sense to me. The kids involved in this, it's them that are being sacrificed, and by distributing the images of them being abused, the Order of the Nine Angles is able to sacrifice them over and over again while corrupting other people in the process. Again, I know this sounds too insane to be true, but here's yet another example of it happening back in 2020. In April of that year, Russian police raided the homes of a group suspected of, and this is a direct quote from the Russian website Now, incitement to murder due to religious and racial hatred and criminal activities against women. I think they thought that these dudes were just neo-Nazis, but during the raids, they found the men were members of a Russian-based chapter of the 09A called Legion Av Satan. Turns out one of these lads had burned down a really old church someplace, and it was never solved until they found photos of him setting it on fire in his house. But that wasn't the worst part of it. As I was reading about this group, I remember thinking, okay, well, at least these lads weren't pedos, but Then lower down the article from the Russian website, I saw that they were. They had been grooming kids in this place, Krasnodar, where they lived, and were trying to get them into underage prostitution. And I imagined that they were going to profit in some way from it. But that's not the point with these Order of the Nine Angles people. It's about suffering. It's about the suffering of innocent people. And that's what they trade in, and it's because human suffering makes Satan more powerful, so they say. It has to be a specific kind of human suffering, though. The kind that doesn't improve a person. Things like grief, severe physical pain, or the lifelong mental scarring that comes with being abused at a really young age. And I'm sure you'll agree, the Order of the Nine Angles rabbit hole makes for some of the worst stuff you've ever heard, and by the time I'd finished reading about it, I was in two minds about my old mate not getting any jail time. He was 14 when he got into that order, 16 when he was arrested, so yeah, I can put that down to something a stupid teenage boy would do. But the order is no joke, and the fact that he had some of their human sacrifice documents downloaded on his computer was very worrying. I'm not saying that we should lock everyone up who does or says something silly on the internet, but reading through all the 09A stuff makes me wonder if a mistake hasn't been made. And I hope my old mate turns a new leaf, and it was all just a silly phase to him. I mean, he's definitely sorry that he got caught, because I know for a fact that he's got all kinds of restrictions placed on him. And don't ask me how I know. Everyone knows everyone in Cornwall, but I know he can't go on certain websites or talk to certain people, and if he does, he's in serious trouble. That'd definitely have me thinking I've made a mistake here, and I really do hope that he sees it that way, because honestly, the alternative is bloody well terrifying, isn't it? If he cracks on with life and it becomes something daft that he did back when he was a lad, then good on him. But if not, well, I imagine I'll be reading about him at some point in the future, for whatever terrible thing that he does, in the name of the devil. Chad Dable was born on August 11th of 1968 and was raised Mormon in the city of Springville, Utah. Following high school, he was accepted into Brigham Young University, but 1 year into his education, he applied to be a missionary, after which he spent 2 years in New Jersey. After returning to BYU, Chad graduated with a bachelor's in journalism and then went on to work as a copy editor for the Ogden-based publication, The Standard Examiner. In 1990, a 22-year-old Chad would marry a girl named Tammy Douglas, and the couple welcomed their first child into the world shortly afterwards. Outwardly, Chad was living the life of a clean-cut Mormon 20-something, but beneath the surface, he began to entertain some deeply unsettling thoughts and hobbies. For instance, while he was still a student at BYU, Chad developed an interest in cemeteries. It started as a part-time job, digging graves in the evenings after his studies were completed. But after a while, it seems Chad started to enjoy the act of digging fresh graves among those already occupied. Even after getting his copy editor's job over at the Standard Examiner, Chad maintained a second full-time appointment as the sexton of Springville Cemetery. He eventually resigned from his position in the late 90s, but only after becoming fixated on a new and very different kind of hobby. In 2001, Chad published One Foot in the Grave, a non-fiction book that chronicled his experiences working in cemeteries. Thanks to a few poignant tracks regarding mourning and mortality, Chad's first serious offering was fairly well received. But then for his second outing, Chad took a radically different direction. He began to write what might be referred to as Mormon end times fiction, stories that depicted apocalyptic situations and dystopian futures. They often featured thinly veiled versions of his friends and family as protagonists, with recurring themes centering around supernatural voices giving instructions to his characters. When asked where he got these ideas from, Chad gave a very interesting response. In the author's note of one of his novels, Chad explained that suffering not one, but 2 near-death experiences in his life had allowed him to see, and I quote, beyond the veil. I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed in my books, he writes. I'm really not that creative. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes that I am shown are real events that will happen. While his claims were well received among certain sections of his audience, many were turned off by Chad's wild claims and wilder plot lines, and by 2009, his readership began to shrink. Chad began catering more and more to the mostly radical Mormon readership that remained, and to supplement his income, he began giving speeches at LDS events concerned with the second coming of Jesus and other such end-time scenarios. Over time, this led to Chad's religious convictions becoming more and more extreme, and by 2011, he was claiming to have visions regarding the end of days. He claimed to see earthquakes so powerful that California and Oregon would sink into the Pacific, along with wars so destructive they'd engulf entire continents. But it wasn't until 2015 that he claimed to hear the voice of God, and apparently, God was telling him to move to Rexburg, Idaho. But right around the same time Chad was driving Tammy and their 5 children over to Idaho, a woman in Texas was opening up one of his books, and her name was Lori Vallow. Born Lori Noreen Cox in Loma Linda, California, on June 26 of 1973, Lori was raised Mormon, and by 2015 was married to her 4th husband, Charles Vallow. Having married in 2006, the couple adopted Charles' grandnephew, J.J. Vallow, as the boy's birth parents were unable to care for him, and by all accounts, the marriage was Lori's happiest and most stable to date. But in 2015, when Lori became interested in Chad's Standing in Holy Places series of books, she experienced something of a spiritual reawakening. She became increasingly invested in radical religious beliefs, read dozens of books detailing near-death experiences, and began listening to podcasts hosted by excommunicated Mormons. 3 years later, in October of 2018, Lori attended a Preparing a People event in the state of Utah. One of the speakers was Chad Daybell. Enraptured by his vivid representations of the end times, Lori approached Chad following one of his speeches and reportedly began flirting with him. Chad then told Lori that he believed they'd been married in previous lifetimes, and after exchanging phone numbers, they began a secretive correspondence. Under the guise of maintaining a professional relationship, Chad and Lori made joint appearances on several episodes of the Preparing a People podcast. She claimed to have been captivated by his unique and outspoken beliefs. In reality, the two were conducting a deeply sordid extramarital affair. And over time, a small but deeply fanatical cult formed around Chad and Lori. He christened their organization the Church of the Firstborn, before crowning himself its one and only leader. The group consisted of Lori and her brother Alex Cox, along with Lori's friends Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines, the latter of whom ended up married to Lori's brother. All had been raised as deep adherents to the Mormon Church, but on Chad's orders, they relinquished their beliefs with a chilling degree of relish. Despite being rejected by the mainstream Mormon Church, the concept of reincarnation played a huge role in Chad's belief system. He claimed to have lived 31 previous lives, some on distant planets while inhabiting the bodies of advanced species of xenomorph, and one inhabiting the body of St. James the Less, a figure from early Christianity. Lori, on the other hand, had lived a total of 21 previous lives, 5 of which she'd spent in the company of Chad, and one in which she inhabited the body of Mary French, the great-grandmother of the LDS's founder, Joseph Smith. They were sealed, as Chad phrased it, following their marriages in previous lives, and conveniently, this relationship superseded those of their earthly marriages. When follower Melanie Gibb suggested that Chad and Lori should divorce their spouses, Lori told her that they were not permitted to, due to information they were receiving from, and I quote, the other side of the veil. Yet while Chad and Lori had no problem granting themselves a couple of heavenly hall passes, they were incredibly judgmental when it came to other people. Chad categorized people as either light or dark, depending on whether he associated them with Christ or Satan, but his judgment was far from arbitrary. He and Lori employed a uniquely elaborate scoring system, making people up for virtuous or saintly characteristics and marking them down for morally dubious or outright sinful behavior. Those who scored highly were considered to be reincarnations of famous figures from Christian history, while those on the bottom end of the scale were considered to be possessed by evil spirits. If the group liked you and deemed you worthy of saving, they might perform what they referred to as a casting, a ceremony in which they try to cast away evil spirits through prayers and scripture readings. However, if the demons inside a possessed person were too heavily entrenched and thus impossible to exorcise, Chad and Lori claimed the only possible remedy was death. As you can tell, the passage of time saw Chad and Lori's beliefs become more and more extreme, and eventually, Chad began making apocalyptic proclamations and insisted the end of the world would come on July 22nd of 2020. He told his followers that he was guided by angels and could see hidden truths, while Lori claimed to be an exalted goddess, able to see the future and unconcerned with earthly laws. She became increasingly disinterested with her husband, Charles Vallow, and in February of 2019, she told him that she no longer cared about their marriage or their adopted son, JJ. Lori then loaded up her truck and disappeared for almost 3 whole months. When she finally returned home, she was confronted by her husband, and a vicious argument erupted. During the fight, Lori told Charles that he was possessed by the evil spirit of a man named Ned Schneider, and that this was the root of all the negativity in their marriage. But that's not all. Lori then told Charles that rather than a mere mortal, she was a living deity, assigned to carry out the work of the 144,000 on the occasion of Christ's second coming, which, coincidentally, was only 18 months away. There was much work to be done between that day and the date of Christ's return, and if Charles got in her way, Lori would murder him. The threat to his life prompted Charles to consider divorce, but ultimately, he decided not to give up on her. Lori was quite clearly suffering from severe mental health issues, and as her husband, it's reasonable to believe Charles felt a great deal of responsibility for her. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. Right around the same time Charles decided to stick around and work on his marriage, his wife had stopped referring to him by name altogether. In secret text exchanges between Chad and her brother Alex, Lori routinely called her husband Ned, or Hiplos, the latter being the name of the demon thought to have possessed him. Lori told members of her small but fanatical cult that Charles had become a zombie, and that if he couldn't be redeemed through prayer and casting, there would be grave consequences. But before efforts to save his soul have even commenced, Charles Vallow discovered his wife's affair. Somehow, Charles managed to obtain the email address of Tammy Daybell, Chad's long-suffering wife. He drafted a long and heartfelt email informing Tammy of their spouse's infidelities after apologizing for the pain his revelation might cause. Shockingly, after reading through the email, Tammy Daybell simply deleted it and then blocked Charles's email address. Following a huge confrontation regarding the discovery of the affair, Lori left Chad's home to stay in Chandler, Arizona, with little JJ splitting his time between his parents. Then on July 11th of 2019, Charles drove over to Lori's home to pick up JJ, but upon his arrival, he was confronted by none other than Lori's brother, Alex. There was an altercation between the two. Charles retrieved a baseball bat from the trunk of his car. Alex Cox responded by shooting him dead. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, Lori's daughter from her third husband, later confirmed that Charles did indeed arm himself with a bat, but had run back to the house by the time the shooting commenced and couldn't provide any further insight into the moments before Charles' death. Incredibly, and most likely based on Tylee's testimony, no charges were filed against Alex, and the shooting was deemed to be self-defense. Neighbors reported that later the next day, they witnessed a very loud and very jubilant pool party at Lori's Arizona home. And by August of 2019, Lori had relocated her family to Rexburg, Idaho, in order to be closer to Chad. Upon her arrival, neighbors noticed that little JJ's behavior appeared erratic, and that Lori often left him outside to play alone, without adult supervision and for long periods of time. When confronted about this, Lori neglected to mention that young JJ was autistic, and instead told neighbors that he was, quote, her niece's drug baby. Just weeks later, Lori and her brother Alex took Tylee on a hiking trip to Yellowstone National Park. They walked the trails, ate snacks, but when their trip drew to a close, only Lori and Alex climbed back into her truck. Lori would later tell neighbors that Tylee had been accepted into Brigham Young University on some kind of early scholarship program for gifted high schoolers. In reality, no one would ever see Tylee again. A few weeks after the Yellowstone trip, on September 22nd of 2019, Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, David Warwick, were staying at Lori's home. And in the evening, Warwick saw Alex Cox taking a sleeping JJ upstairs to his bedroom, and this marked the last time anyone would see the boy alive. A few days later, Lori informed Rexburg Elementary School that she would now be homeschooling her adopted son. But the truth was infinitely more disturbing. In October 2019, 2 Venmo payments were made from Tylee's account to her older half-brother, Colby Ryan, with odd messages attached. When he expressed concern towards Tylee via text, he received responses from her cell phone indicating that she was safe, but too busy to talk. Melanie Gibb later said that Lori and Chad were convinced Tylee and JJ were possessed and had become zombies. Zolima Pastenes also testified that Chad had told his followers how, shortly before the little boy's disappearance, young JJ would soon die. But JJ's death was not the only one Chad predicted around this time. He began telling his followers that his wife, Tammy, was in limbo after becoming possessed by a spirit named Viola. Her case was a severe one. If they didn't act soon, she was in danger of becoming a zombie, and that was something which Chad was never going to allow. Right around the same time Colby Ryan was receiving Venmo payments from his dead sister, Tammy Daybell returned home from an errand, parked in her driveway, and stepped out of her car. A masked man stepped out from the shadows, aimed an assault rifle at her, then pulled the trigger. Tammy screamed, but her shriek of terror was the only sound to pierce the evening silence. The rifle had misfired. Tammy later told police that due to his mask, she had been unable to identify the man who attempted to shoot her. Police warned her to be much more vigilant and to report any further developments, but it was no good. 10 days later, Tammy was found dead in her home, apparently from natural causes. Chad claimed that she had retired the previous night with what he called a terrible cough, and that she tragically died in her sleep. He also mentioned that Tammy had been experiencing low blood pressure, seizures, and negative reactions with homeopathic medicines, though none of her medical records supported his claims. 3 days later, at Tammy's funeral, mourners found Chad's behavior extremely suspicious. The funeral came so soon, but it still felt so planned, one said. Others said Chad seemed businesslike, and that he didn't seem upset, and that he wasn't crying but was trying to cry. Mourners were then deeply perturbed when Chad referred to his late wife as lazy and not easy to live with during what was supposed to be a heartfelt eulogy. Chad's sister-in-law, Heather Daybell, thought his behavior verged on the bizarre and later stated that he just didn't seem upset. In the weeks that followed, Chad began introducing Lori to his friends and family. One of his neighbors, Alice Gilbert, described her first meeting with Lori as awkward, as despite the fact Chad had only recently buried his wife of 3 decades, he seemed remarkably happy. Gilbert observed that the couple was very affectionate, laughing and joking with one another, even as Lori explained how her daughter had passed away just 6 months prior. This marked the first admission that Tylee was deceased, but since Alice Gilbert was just a neighbor, she had no inkling whatsoever of the admission's sinister implications. Despite the cryptic hints at their terrible crimes, Chad and Lori played the role of a happy, wholesome Mormon couple who had bonded over personal tragedy. But by late November, their masks were beginning to slip. On November 26th of 2019, police visited Lori's Rexburg townhouse at the request of Kay Vallow, sister of the recently deceased Charles Vallow. She hadn't heard from little JJ for weeks and was beginning to grow concerned, and so on the afternoon of the 26th, 2 Rexburg police officers stopped by Lori's home. There, they found Chad Daybell and Alex Cox, who informed them that while Lori wasn't home, they were more than happy to answer any questions the officers might have. When asked where JJ was, Alex Cox claimed that he was with his paternal grandmother, Kay Vallow, the same woman who had called in the welfare check to begin with. Officers knew that he was lying, but played along before asking Chad where Lori was. Chad replied that he, quote, hardly knew Lori and was only present at her home because he was a friend of Alex. Again, that was demonstrably false. Marriage licenses are a matter of public record, and seeing as Chad and Lori had gotten hitched in Hawaii just weeks prior, the cops knew that he was lying too. When they eventually got in touch with Lori, she too provided the police with easily disprovable information. She claimed JJ was staying with Melanie Gibb in Arizona. One phone call was all it took to prove this was a lie. Chad and Lori might have made grave mistakes in lying to the police, but they weren't entirely moronic. They knew the game was up, and just hours after police came to question them, they loaded up a truck with their belongings and fled to Hawaii. Right around the same time Chad and Lori were moving into a rental home on the island of Kauai, police officers were conducting thorough searches of their homes. Days later, the Rexburg Police Department officially pronounced JJ and Tylee as missing persons and asked for the public's assistance in locating them. Police also announced that Chad and Lori were persons of interest following their prompt departure from the mainland United States, and that the children's disappearance might well be linked to the suspicious death of Chad's late wife, Tammy. As interest in the case grew, so did the amount of media attention it received, and before long, news networks all over the country were broadcasting interviews with people who described the errant couple's beliefs as frightening, disturbed, and cult-like. Incredibly, Chad and Lori released a statement through their attorney on December 23rd of 2019. An extract from the statement reads as follows. Chad Daybell was a loving husband, and he has the support of his children in this matter, while Lori is a devoted mother who resents assertions to the contrary. All false allegations will be addressed once we have moved beyond speculation and rumor. Their statement was met with a response in early 2020 when a collection of the couple's relatives issued a public message begging Lori and Chad return the children. They announced a reward of $20,000 being offered to anyone who either returned the missing children or shared information directly contributing to their return. Weeks later, on January 25th of 2020, Lori and Chad were located in Kauai and were handed a court order requiring Lori to physically produce Tylee and JJ at the Idaho Department of Welfare within the next 5 days. The next day, police seized the couple's rental car and searched their rental townhome in Princeville. Both Tylee's debit card and JJ's iPad were recovered. Just hours after their Princeville home was searched, the Daybells were confronted by an East Idaho news reporter named Nate Eaton. Eaton asked them where the children were. Chad and Lori refused to answer. Finally, on February 20th of 2020, Lori was arrested by the Kauai Police Department before being extradited to Idaho. Her arrest prompted Chad to also return to Idaho, where he tried convincing his neighbor, Alice Gilbert, to put her home up for bond to get Lori out of prison. When she asked why, he told her Jesus had given him the idea. When Alice then confronted him on what he had said about Lori's daughter being dead, Chad gave a cagey answer about it being a custody issue and then promptly fled the scene. Months went by without development, until finally, in June of 2020, police found human remains buried in unmarked graves in the backyard of Chad's home. The bodies were located in an area the Daybell's family called the Pet Cemetery, as it had been used to bury their cats and dogs. As the property was being searched, Chad phoned Lori in jail to warn her about the situation. Then, after police found and began to unearth the bodies, he tried to flee the scene. He was chased down, apprehended, and then placed under arrest for concealment of evidence. Days after the discovery of the so-called Pet Cemetery, police confirmed the human remains found on Chad's property belonged to the missing children, Tylee and JJ. Tylee's body had been burned, and her hands had been cut off, while little JJ's body was relatively undamaged, having been wrapped in plastic before being gently lowered into the makeshift grave. However, unlike JJ, Tylee's remains had not been treated with such reverence. Her corpse was so decomposed and damaged that her cause of death could not officially be determined, while JJ's had been carefully dispatched with a plastic bag over his head and duct tape over his mouth, possibly after being drugged. Following the announcement that the children's bodies had been found, Chad Daybell was officially excommunicated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the basis of his religious teachings, some of which were described as those of a doomsday cult. At the trials, Lori was found guilty of the murder of her children. She received 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders and conspiracy, with an additional 2 life sentences and a 10-year term for grand theft to be served concurrently. She now resides at the Women's Correctional Center in Pocatello, Idaho. Chad's convictions came the following year when he was pronounced guilty on all counts, including murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to death in June of 2024 and is currently being held at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise. If he's a man of conviction and believes he'll be reincarnated on another plane of existence, facing the lethal injection shouldn't be too frightening for old 31 lives Chad. But if those convictions waver, if his beliefs were merely a tool with which he could manipulate and murder without feeling an ounce of guilt, then it'll be a morbid comfort to know he faced the same mortal terror as those his victims did in their own final moments on Earth. The man we are about to discuss has gone by many names. He's been known as Dr. York, Chief Black Eagle, Isa al-Hadi al-Mahdi, and even His Excellency, Dr. Malachi Kobina York. At one point in his life, our subject went so far as to adopt the title, and this is a direct quote, folks, so don't hold on to your britches, Imperial Grand Potentate, the Noble Reverend Dr. Malachi Z. York, 33 degrees, 720 degrees. If you ask the man himself, he might tell you that he spent his life in the pursuit of knowledge. But the proof, it seems, is in the pudding, as despite his so-called quest for enlightenment, the man's legacy remains one of hatred, fraud, and child molestation. He might have granted himself all manner of lofty but ultimately meaningless titles, but to your infinite relief, I'll refer to him only by the name on his birth certificate. And this is the story of Dwight D. York. Throughout his life, York would claim to have been born in places such as Ghana, Baltimore, New York, or New Jersey. But according to his birth certificate, he was born on July 26th of 1945 in Boston, Massachusetts. He claimed that at age 7, he was sent to the city of Aswan in southern Egypt, where he supposedly received an Islamic education at the hands of his grandfather. Later in life, he wrote that, "My grandfather, as Sayyid Abdur Rahman al-Mahdi, the Imam of the Ansars in the Sudan until 1959 AD, upon looking into my eyes, foretold that I was the one who would possess the light." York then claimed that following his education, he returned to the United States in 1957 and, at the age of 12, settled with his family in Teaneck, New Jersey. By the late 1960s, a young Dwight York had taken to calling himself Imam Isa. He developed an interest in organizations such as the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple of America, but instead of joining one of the many pre-established black nationalist movements, he decided to found his own. After changing his name to Iman Isa Abdullah, he founded a movement that had become known as the Nuwaubian Nation, and with a handful of loyal proselytizers, he set about growing the organization among the ripe ideological seedbed of 1970s Brooklyn. Wearing green and black dashikis, York and his followers set up a bookstore specializing in black nationalist literature and would attempt to recruit those who visited. The method was an effective one, and by the end of the 1970s, York commanded a congregation of between 2,000 and 3,000 followers. Throughout the 70s, York and his acolytes imbibed a relatively simple mix of Orthodox Islam and black nationalism. However, as the 1980s rolled around, York began to preach a much different form of religion. While drawing from various religious and historical themes, he renamed his movement the Holy Seed Baptist Synagogue and unveiled a new logo featuring the six-pointed star of Judaism, the Islamic crescent, and the Ankh, an Egyptian symbol that also associated with pre-Islamic Sudan. This upset a great deal of his conservative Muslim followers, and the group began hemorrhaging adherents. But York wasn't done. He renamed the group a second time, calling it the Yamasee Native American Tribe, and began teaching his followers that they were affiliated with the Muskogee Nation. He told them their ancestors had not been brought over on slave ships, and had instead migrated to America during the time of Pangaea, a supercontinent that existed around 2 to 3 million years ago, which eventually separated into the continents of the present day. Naturally, this sounded nothing short of unhinged to the majority of his followers, who understood their roots were in Africa and not the Americas. And once he started changing religious ideas, the older followers became skeptical and left the group, said former follower Robert J. Rohan. That's what happened to me. He came up with an idea to move down south, apparently because he was under FBI investigation, Rohan added. But then he told us it's because we were moving to meet our spiritual parents. I guess he forgot to give us 2 explanations, and that's what made a lot of the brothers think that he was full of it. Following the announcement that the group was relocating to Georgia, York once again rebranded his organization. He changed his name to Malachi York, effective March 12, 1993, then declared his movement the United Nuwaubian Nation of Moors. A group that once numbered in their thousands now stood at just 200 to 300 strong, and ironically, York was more powerful than ever. He'd built up quite a war chest throughout the past 23 years, and due to the FBI's interest in his movement, many believed that this was done through illegal means. Yet the fact remains that York had enough capital at his disposal to purchase a 476-acre plot of land near Eatonton, Georgia, on which the compound known as Tama-Re was constructed over a period of 3 years. The New York Times later reported that the compound featured 40-foot pyramids, obelisks, statues of gods and goddesses, as well as a giant sphinx. Yet the Times also reported that Tama-Re was not York's full-time residence. Instead, York stayed at a $500,000 mansion in Athens, Georgia, about 60 miles away from Tama-Re, that he purchased with so-called community funds. After completely relocating the group in 1993, and utterly drunk on the power he wielded, York began preaching an increasingly radical form of his own personal religion, Nuwaubianism. The Southern Poverty Law Center described this belief as a black supremacist idea with worship of the Egyptians and their pyramids, a belief in UFOs, and various conspiracies related to the Illuminati and the Bilderbergers. The profile on their website included quotes from a letter penned by York himself, on which is stated, "The Caucasians had not been chosen to lead the world. They lacked true emotions in their creation. We never intended them to be peaceful. They were bred to be killers, with low reproduction levels and a short lifespan. Another Nuwaubian racial origin theory has Caucasians descending from Cain. Adam and Eve were sent to the Aegean Islands between Asia and Europe, where they started having children, York wrote. Each couple's firstborn child was an albino, and those albinos are called Cain in the Bible, and Cain is short for Caucasian. At some point after moving to Georgia, York began telling his followers that he was an alien. "I am an extraterrestrial master teacher from the planet Risk," he wrote. "My kind has been coming to this planet before it had life form on it. My incarnation as an Ila Mutajasid, or Avatara, was originally in the year 1945 AD. In order to get here, I traveled by one of the smaller passenger crafts called Sham, out of a mother plane called Merkaba, or Nibiru." York also informed his adherents that the so-called mother plane, or Nibiru, would launch the Crystal City, sometimes called New Jerusalem, to our solar system from its position in Orion. He claimed that this would be a 40-year process, by which the 144,000 chosen few would be transported to the planet craft Nibiru from August of 2003 to August of 2043. The chosen few would then be groomed for 1,000 years before being returned to Earth for the final battle against the Luciferians, and thus redeeming man from the 6,000-year rulership of the devil and his seed. To York's followers, his word was prophecy. Outsiders had a much simpler view. "They're a cult," said Ghazi Y. Kankan, a representative from the Council on American Islamic Relations. "They consider their leader a prophet, which means they have deviated from the Islamic way," he said. But York had not simply deviated from pre-established Islamic teachings. He had deviated from basic human decency, too. As far back as the group's days in Brooklyn, York had established strict sexual practices within the Nuwaubian community and declared that he and he alone had the right to intimate relations with the group's women and girls, including the wives and daughters of his followers. Theodore Gabriel, emeritus lecturer in theology and religious studies at the University of Gloucestershire, wrote that, while extolling the virtues and importance of family life and the conjugal relationship, York denies relationships to his followers except at strictly controlled intervals. He urges his female followers to pattern themselves on the Islamic paradigms of the wife and mother, apparently desiring the creation of stable family units. But in reality, the husbands and wives are segregated in dormitories, separated also from their children. York permits spouses to cohabit only once every 3 months. They are permitted to meet in the green room prior to appointment only. Having managed to coerce his followers into allowing access to their wives and children, York's proclivities became increasingly depraved as the years went by. Many had suspected the FBI's interest in him was related to potential financial crimes, and while fraud and racketeering was indeed taking place, York was eventually arrested for something far, far worse. In 2002, following anonymous complaints that might well have come from his followers, York was arrested and charged with more than 100 counts of sexually molesting dozens of children, some as young as 4 years old. According to Bill Ozinski, who wrote a 2007 book about York in the case, when he, York, was finally indicted, state prosecutors literally had to cut back the number of counts listed from well beyond 1,000 to slightly more than 200 because they feared a jury simply wouldn't believe the magnitude of York's evil. It's believed to be the nation's largest child abuse prosecution ever directed at a single person in terms of number of victims and number of alleged criminal acts. Following his arrest in 2003, York attempted to negotiate a plea bargain with the federal government. The letter to the case's presiding judge read as follows: "Your Honor, with all due respect to your government, your nation, and your court, We, the indigenous people of this land, have our own rights, accepted sovereignty, our own governments. We are a sovereign people. Yamasee, Native American Creeks, Seminole, Washita Mound Builders. All I'm asking is that the court recognize that I am an indigenous person. Your court does not have jurisdiction over me. I should be transferred to the Moores Cherokee Council Court, in which I will get a trial by juries of my peers, and I cannot get a fair trial, Your Honor, if I'm being tried by the settlers or the Confederates. I have to be tried by Native Americans. As a Native American, that's my inalienable rights, and it's on record. Since York's appeal was grounded in his belief that he was indigenous to North America, the judge promptly rejected the appeal. York was then convicted of transporting minors across state lines for the purposes of molestation, as well as racketeering and financial reporting violations, then sentenced to 135 years in prison. York's followers assert a number of defenses, including that their leader, Malachi Z. York, who was charged and convicted, is not the same person as the Dwight D. York, who is listed in court documents as the defendant. Others say that York was set up by his son Jacob in coordination with Al-Qaeda-linked American Moss, who were jealous of York's influence among African-American Muslims. York himself believes that his betrayal, arrest, trial, and imprisonment, along with his eventual release, were foretold in Chapter 10 of Zecharia Sitchin's book, The War of the Gods and the Men, with York claiming to be represented by the supreme Egyptian deity, Ra. York's followers then said that since 1999, York has been the Consul General of Monrovia, Liberia, under the appointment of then-President Charles Taylor. They argued that he should be given diplomatic immunity from prosecution and extradited as a persona non grata to Liberia, but both American and Liberian officials have rejected this claim. As of 2024, Dwight York is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. He is inmate number 17911-054 in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day with a projected release date of July 12th of the year 2120. If Dr. York, or Chief Black Eagle, or whatever he wants to call himself, is indeed an intergalactic educator from a distant planet, then maybe he'll survive long enough to see that release date. If not, and he proves to be a mere mortal, then he'll die where a man of his character belongs, cold, alone, and far away from the innocent. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it's all witchcraft.